I want to thank you all for coming today to our annual Robert J. Cummings lecture in the Department of African Studies. This year is particularly special for probably several reasons. The Department of African Studies is celebrating its 60th anniversary, so this is one of several events that we have organized for this semester and for this year to celebrate that. And so, yes. Indeed. So it's also particularly fitting for us to bring not just an esteemed scholar, who we always bring to give the Cummings lecture, but an esteemed alum and scholar of Howard University and of our department, Dr. Carole Boyce Davies from Cornell University, who will be introduced to you in a minute. I also wanted to just highlight quickly that this event is being co-sponsored by the Department of Afro-American Studies, and also in concert with the centennial celebrations for the Moreland Spingarn collections here at the library. So we thank them for their support and their involvement in this program. I'm going to turn it over quickly to Dr. Cham, the chair of the Department of African Studies, to make some welcoming remarks, and then we will introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. Good afternoon. On behalf of President Frederick and Dean Badigation, College of Arts and Sciences, and Dean Gary Harris, who is sitting behind there, Dean of the Graduate School, and my colleagues in the Department of African Studies and the entire faculty, I just want to say a warm welcome to all of you, and thank you all for coming to be with us this afternoon and also be a part of this celebration that, as Krista just mentioned, we have been celebrating, we have been doing all semester long. It's a very important historic moment for us, and we're very happy that we're able to welcome one of our distinguished alumni to be here with us to deliver this lecture. I also want to introduce the partner and wife of the person for whom this lecture series is named, Bob Cummings. He and his wife came here to Howard University in 1976, I believe it was. Yeah, and that's Dr. Melbourne Cummings, who is in the School of Communications here. And when Bob came, you have his bio on the program, but Bob was really a towering figure here at Howard University and beyond Howard University as well. He literally built this program on the foundation of the achievements of some of the giants who started the program back in 1953. But the period that Bob was here between 1976 up to the time that he passed away untimely in 2007, the program really was elevated to a different level, both nationally and internationally. And Bob himself, as the leader of the African Studies program, and later on the Department of African Studies, when the transition was made, he literally set the foundation for what would become really one of the signal programs in the interdisciplinary study of Africa worldwide. His achievements are really quite significant and too many to go over here, so I would encourage you to take a look at his bio in the program that you have. And when he passed away, we as a department decided that it would be an appropriate gesture to initiate a lecture series in his honor. So we are glad that we're able to continue this. We started it way back. In the back of your program, you would see the events, the lecturers that we have had in the past, from some of the luminaries in South African freedom struggle like Ahmed Kathrada, to some of our alumni who came back to also be with us, Dr. John Kakonge, for example. And today we're also very fortunate to welcome our distinguished speaker today, who is a graduate of the program. She graduated in 1974. I'm not going to introduce her. Babs Bryant will be doing that chore in a minute. But Carole is a very good friend. We go a long way back through the African Literature Association, as well as the African Studies Association. And I remember back in the late, early 90s, or I believe it was probably in the late 80s or early 90s, at a conference in California, in Claremont, California, Pitzer College. I was giving a paper on this Senegalese writer who had just published this seminal text, Une si longue lettre, that some of you probably are quite familiar with, Mariam Abbas, So Long a Letter. And in the audience was this group of scholars led by Carole, Boyce Davies, people like Eileen Julian, Anne Adams Graves, with whom you worked and co-edited that seminal text, Ngambika, Janice Mays, and so on and so forth. They were all in the audience, and these were like the leading lights in relation to African gender studies, feminist scholarship that was being fashioned by all of these scholars. And here I was, the only male on the panel, and I thought to myself, man, I'm giving myself up a sacrifice here. But the response from them was really very, very comforting. And to me, I began to forge a much greater, closer relationship with Carole and all of them subsequent to that, and was able to learn a great deal and profit a great deal from that relationship. So when we called on her earlier this year to consider coming to give this lecture, she did not hesitate one bit. She said, I would gladly do it. So we're very, very grateful that she is here. And I want to welcome you, Carole. When I spoke to her at first, I told her that the lecture was scheduled for the browsing room here at Founders Library. Then she chuckled on the phone and said, you know what? I used to work there in that very room. So this is home for you. So welcome home. We are here, homecoming at Howard University. So thank you. Mr.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Carole Boyce Davies, an African diaspora studies scholar, is professor of Africana Studies and English at Cornell University. Prior to her joining the faculty at Cornell, Dr. Davies served as the director of African New World Studies at Florida International University, where she developed a new MA program and received a recurring 3-year Ford Foundation grant for developing intersections of African diaspora knowledge communities. Her most recent book is Caribbean Spaces, Escape Routes from Twilight Zones. She is also the author of the prize-winning Left of Karl Marx, The Political Life of Black Communist Claudia Jones, and Black Woman, Writing and Identity, Migrations of the Subjects, which is considered a theoretical base for many studies in the field of Black feminist theory and writing of migration. Dr. Davies is a distinguished speaker, having spoken at over 50 U.S. colleges and universities, including Yale, Columbia, University of California, Berkeley, University of Virginia, Ohio State University, and of course, right here at Howard. She has also spoken in over 30 countries, including Brazil, Ecuador, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mauritius, Ghana, England, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Martinique, Cuba, Italy, France, Morocco, and India, and that's just to name a few. In addition to over 100 scholarly articles, Dr. Boyce Davies has also published critical editions, including Gambika, Studies of Women in African Literature, Out of Kumbla, Caribbean Women in Literature, a 2-volume collection of critical and creative writing entitled Moving Beyond Boundaries, International Dimensions of Black Women's Writing, Volume 1, and Black Women's Diasporas, Volume 2. She is co-editor with Ali Mazrui and Isidore Opeku of the African Diaspora, African Origins and New World Identities, and Decolonizing the Academy, African Diaspora Studies. She is also general editor of the 3-volume The Encyclopedia of the African Diaspora. She recently published a collection of the writings of Claudia Jones titled Beyond Containment, Claudia Jones' Autobiographical Reflections and Essays. Hailing from Trinidad and Tobago, she earned an MA in African Studies from Howard University and a PhD in African Literature from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. Her next project is on women and political leadership in the African diaspora. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carole Boyce Davies.
I guess I need to go back. Cool.
Is that the beginning?
Oh, I thought I would start with how I looked when I was here.
Thank you.
Isn't that great? My daughters love this picture because they're like Afro, because now people are wearing Afro and all kinds of things. So you can imagine. This was, I have to thank Mbai for the invitation. This was going to be a book presentation, a book launch. This is the book. It's going to be out by the end of the month, I was told. You know how books are, so. Anyway, so basically when I was talking with him, he said that this would be a good place to sort of, launch it, and that was the way in which I structured my talk, so you'd have to bear with me. It's going to be part reflective. So I'll put this somewhere. Can somebody grab that for me? And you're free to, my publisher said they'll send me that. You can flip through it. And I have some cards circulating so that you can pre-order. But I'm going to leave that up there for a while I talk about my, give a little introductory remarks and then go into what I want to say. I want to say, though, first of all, that it's a pleasure being here for a number of reasons. I see in the audience people that I know and love. Haile Garima, thank you, Haile, for being here. I'm so pleased again to see Mrs. Cummings, one of my former students who is a lawyer in D.C. here, Vonda Harris, is in the audience. Hi, Vonda. I love seeing that you're here. She's also my soror. The Delta's in the house. She's a Delta, too. Right. And all kinds of people like Ian Smart, and I'm sure there are others who I haven't recognized yet, but they're there, so, I'm pleased that you're here. So first I want to begin by recognizing the significance of a lecture honoring Bob Cummings. And I'm pleased that Mrs. Cummings is in the audience, and I thank you for your presence, who was the director following Professor Onwachi, who I also learned left us way too soon last year. I also want to thank African Studies at Howard for inviting me back and in this context. It is indeed an honor to be regarded as a fitting representative of the program's history and mission. Above all, I thank current director, Professor Mbai Cham, for the invitation, and his assistant, Miss Pratt, for her follow-up. And it's always a joy, of course, to return to Howard University. As Mbai said, now keep in mind, Mbai said that a bunch of us were in the audience when he presented his paper. It was because his paper was really good. And we would have got him if it wasn't. And he presented on an aspect of Mariam Abad that many of us did not know. He talked about the fact that her narration had to do with a tradition of the widow divesting herself of all that happened in her marriage. And we learned from that. So Mbai, it wasn't that we were being nice. It was just that we were learning from you as well, right? I learn all the time. So I want to secondly say something that Mbai said, but basically I have to say this. The browsing room is familiar space for me, a kind of home space. I worked in this room as a library assistant under the leadership of librarian Barbara Brown, who had just returned from the Peace Corps in Africa. During the 2 years of my graduate work at African Studies, which was then a walk across there, it was a temporary building right across there, I could always get away quickly. The library staff was very supportive, was a supportive community, which turned a blind eye to the fact that I was typing my thesis all the time while at work, and I could go back and forth to classes and meetings very easily. We also showed amazing film here. If any of you were here in that period, I know Ethelbert was. This is a place that showed all of those early films by Dorothy Dandridge and everybody that, you know, the Lena Horne, Stormy Weather, and all of those films. So we did those kinds of things here and also organized lectures here. But of course, back then as a student, as many of you are, you didn't think you would be the lecturer at some point in the future. So this tells you that you're going to be also doing something like this, right? So to this afternoon's presentation, which was supposed to be a book launch, I've been saying recently that books are sometimes like babies, perhaps because my daughter and her friends are in the baby-making stage of their lives. Babies and books come when they're ready. So we had hoped this was going to be the occasion for the first outdooring, as it's called in Ghana, as it were, of the book Caribbean Spaces, which is due to be out now at the end of this month. The press has sent cards that you can pre-order, and there's a bound typescript of the book that you can flip through, and I have a graphic of the cover, which is available as well. This book is, for me, is experimental in parts. You've heard some of my work, and I feel that at this point in my career, I could just go ahead and be experimental. So it's part academic essays, part reflective essays, part memoir, in a way. And what I'm going to talk about today is going to give you some of the flavor of that part. So when I was asked to do this lecture, I thought it would be a fitting way to present a portion that dealt with Black consciousness, a section of a chapter titled Portable Identity, and I have the table of contents. It's a bit small because I was trying to put everything up there. I should point out that the cover is by Cuban artist Alejandro Garcia, and it's called The Border. And it's actually meant to be like if you're looking down from a plane and you see the landscape unfold, you can see it's, when you look at it up close, you get a better sense of it in terms of looking at how land and water and everything else appears from up above, from space, looking down at it from a plane view. Okay, so to this talk. One, I've been feeling, I was saying lately, some strange disjunctures as far as Africana Studies is concerned. I'm currently a faculty member in the Africana Studies department at Cornell University, one of the first major departments, which in a way set the paradigm for Africana Studies, and one where students were presented in that iconic photograph of being armed to get Black studies off the ground. But in many ways, what has happened at Cornell's Africana recently is in some ways representative of some larger trends in the field at large. I've been one of those on record with a critique of the university's decision to collapse Africana Studies into arts and sciences and ostensibly take over whatever little autonomy it had in the first place. This, as you know, happened unilaterally, as those who followed the events know, with a provost who promised us something like $3 million, which many faculty felt was an amazing, generous act on his part. Of course, you know the answer, right? Show me the money. I don't think we saw it yet. So far, the money hasn't really showed up. But more than that, the administrative maneuvers on the faculty side, if trained in African studies as I was, tend to make one feel at odds with a kind of creeping cultural studies programming without historical content and with little desire to achieve that. And it's easy, given current students' interest in ephemera, to be encouraged to create courses that have that kind of appeal. You know, the sexy courses that have no real content, but they sound really wonderful and so on. The sense of vigorous debate is also not unusual in many other departments, but from my experience, if one speaks critically in Africana Studies, the place like Cornell, one is positioned negatively and excluded from full participation in departments' events. The logic of faculty empowerment is also something which many of us cherish, and much of that seems to disappear. Junior faculty are discouraged to say anything vocal outside of meeting context. In my view, leadership becomes not service but personal advancement. So I have decided then that the cause of these strange disjunctures for me originates in the fact that I was trained at Howard University, an important site for the teaching and empowering of black scholars. My talk today, Black Consciousness, African Studies in Howard University, will provide some of the detail which supports that assertion. So this is a timely return for me, and I propose to weave the personal reflections and political analyses which confirm that assertion. So coming to a black political self. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was killed during my freshman year in university. I stood as a quiet participant amid the outpouring of grief by fellow students, glued to television sets in the lobby of the dormitory, unable to come to terms with the meaning of this violence and reliving the perpetual and senseless destruction of black political leaders. Political awareness had remained on the periphery of my Trinidad childhood, part of a giant backdrop that included family conversations on Marcus Garvey or Tubal Uriah Butler, the great Union leader in Trinidad, and sporadic news events. But I had watched my stepfather order from abroad a book by Dr. Martin Luther King, possibly Strength to Love, 1963, and I would listen to him as he read and reread aloud passages from the great man's text whenever he had a free moment, shaking his legs from side to side as he read. Still, the popular political education of a scholar prime minister, Eric E. Williams, framed my basic consciousness as I came of age via radio broadcasts on colonialism, capitalism, and slavery from a public square dubbed the University of Whitford Square in Port of Spain, Trinidad. Then I could never understand, though, why his former colleague C.L.R. James had been put under house arrest at one point and declared persona non grata in Trinidad. But my teenage round of parties and the excitement of meeting boyfriends following the latest U.S. fashion crazes, movies, and music avidly, as well as preparing for exams and getting ready to leave high school, dominated. The media images of students of similar age marching against segregation in the U.S. played on black and white television sets as unreal as were popular television shows in the Western genre. And back then we used to get in Trinidad things like Bonanza and some of those Western shows, always in, of course, black and white at the time. However, movies in bright color of U.S. black soul culture and music were places where one could get fashion and style ideas and see performed popular songs and dances that one could imitate even more, which were even more prevalent. So my conscious black political self came of age in the United States in the midst of black power activity. It was a black self constructed in full identification with U.S. African American struggles, but with a conscious link to other black struggles internationally. Once I got to university in the United States, life became a round of meetings, rallies, sit-ins, takeovers, marches that colored my sense of a black student self all the way through and into graduate school. For sure, the most critical element of that formation was that one of the major black power proponents was an attractive, politically confident Trinidadian. And let me sort of move to that. I wanted to just point out, as I just back up a little bit and talk about this, because essentially, even though you have this sort of iconic presentation of Cornell students with guns, there was quite a substantial number of women at the heart of what became the takeover, which led to the founding, the full founding of Africana Studies. And some of these are some of those items. I kind of jumped over that really quickly. But the favored representation ended up students with guns, right? Also, it is important to know, backing up a little bit, that the first Africanist Center was also destroyed by us in 1970. This is it there. And this is James Turner, founding director in the current Africana Studies building. Right, okay. So my conscious political, black political self came of age in the U.S., as I indicated, in the midst of black power activity. For sure, the most critical element of that formation was that one of the major black power proponents was an attractive, politically confident Trinidadian in the person of Stokely Carmichael, later renamed Kwame Ture, who was at the forefront of groups like SNCC and the Black Panther Party. In many ways, it was Stokely who provided the guiding identitarian position for black students from the Caribbean at this point in history, and therefore made activist participation perfectly logical and doable. As a Caribbean American, one has a variety of choices as one lives some form of the African American experience in the United States. One of them can be identification, creation, and definition of small or large enclave-like communities with no serious relationship to a large African American community, except perhaps through work, church, or occasional meetings. This, perhaps the most comfortable of routes for the immigrant, allows him or her to build his own type of cultural and social community in the face of dominating white supremacist American ideologies. Another option, though, is to work in terms of communities of struggle, those communities and relationships that see themselves as consciously allied for the advancement of the entire black population globally. This is a model created by Caribbean Pan-Africanists before me and to which I still adhere. It clarifies the example of Kwame Ture, who remains one of the most important icons of my generation of Afro-Caribbean students in the United States. But once when Stokely came to Binghamton to speak, where I was a faculty member, I attended a reception for him at a colleague's house afterwards. I finally got enough nerve to get close enough to tell him I was from Trinidad, expecting that he would share this identity. He responded loudly, "Trinidad? That place that would not let me in?" And he proceeded to tell the story of Trinidad barring him entry to those in the immediate listening circle. He was referring to the decision by the same Eric Williams-led People's National Movement government that in the height of black power did not want such a leading icon of that movement to enter Trinidad, even if it was his birthplace. The Trinidadian activists have since remedied this with a Stokely Carmichael lecture that opens up the Emancipation celebration every year and welcomed him home very elaborately as part of the opening of that. But for Stokely then it was a sore point that would not yet heal. And as a young activist Africana Studies professor, I understood. A few years later, though, some students invited Stokely back again, and not wanting to repeat that encounter or stir up this political memory of Trinidad, I stayed politely away. Before the lecture, though, as I sat in the audience, one of the student handlers came to tell me that Stokely had instructed, "There's a sister from Trinidad here, tell her to come back here." I was ushered to the room where he waited to find him sitting alone with campus security at the door. He told me he wanted me to sit with him and to keep him company until the lecture started, and we chatted amicably. He told me that there was a line they would use during times of active movement work in similar contexts like this one: "Who would protect us from the protectors?" I believe my presence then added to his sense of security for several reasons. His presentation was its usual electrifying manner, a demonstrable ability to field or even invite questions with dexterity, and knowledge from activist Zionist members of the Jewish Student Union who challenged him on his support of the Palestinians. Still, he had a certain vulnerability, even with all of that public demonstration of power, that I would imagine all of the activist men who took assertive positions had. So secondly, black consciousness, Washington, D.C. Howard University has long been a desired location for black students from around the world. There are numerous stories of people preferring Howard over Harvard, or thinking Harvard was Howard. It did not help that the names were similar in sound. Its educational leadership and international reputation was legendary. For many Caribbean and African students, it was the preferred choice, cemented for my generation, because the same Prime Minister Eric E. Williams of capitalism and slavery fame had actually taught at Howard University before returning to lead Trinidad to independence, and made sure we all knew this. So choosing Howard, as I did in 1972, was for me a natural outcome, a desired choice. At Howard, I began an MA in African Studies in a department then under the directorship of P. Chike Onwachi, who I learned passed last year. He taught the Theory and Methods course, and I can still remember him beginning with a lecture that centered the African will conceptually. One of his favorite topics was Leo Hansberry, 1894 to 1965, who he would repeatedly say Africana Studies at Howard should be named after. There's much more detail on Hansberry now, though in my view there's still an incomplete recognition in the field of his work, that is. And talk about things coming full circle. As I sought quickly online to see what was available on Hansberry, I found an essay by Ethiopian scholar Ayile Bekele, a former Cornell colleague, which suggests that Hansberry, actually may have been the one who coined the term Africana Studies in an outline titled Africana and African Past. So it is critical for me, as in any talk that includes African studies at Howard, to at least affirm Hansberry's role. I noted that Northwestern University's program in African Studies also recently celebrated its 60th anniversary. In effect, then, these two programs, the one at Northwestern and this one here at Howard, one at the preeminent HBCU and the other at under Hansberry's guidance, and the other at Northwestern, a Midwest predominantly white university under Herskovits, presents still the two tendencies in African studies that one sees in the field. Herskovits then would corner the approach of theorizing African retentions. Howard would begin with a study of ancient African history, to which Onwuachi cemented with the African world paradigm, a global approach to studying African and African-derived cultures. In September 1922, Hansberry joined the faculty of Howard University, where he started the African Civilization section of the History Department. Hansberry had received a master's from Harvard in 1932 and had done additional postgraduate work. Interestingly, at Oxford and Carole University. Interestingly, Hansberry, when he was at the point where he should be defending his dissertation, was told that there was no scholar with the knowledge more knowledge than he had that could actually examine him. Just think about that, what that meant at the time. As a professor at Howard University, Hansberry taught courses on African civilizations and cultures. By the mid-1930s, he was internationally recognized by his peers as an outstanding scholar in the field. Among his students and proteges were two future African leaders. One was the future Ghanaian leader, Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah would, as you know, become the first Prime Minister of Ghana, and Nnamdi Azikwe, who studied anthropology under him from 1920 to 1929. Azikwe would become the first president of Nigeria. In 1961, then Nigerian Governor General Azikwe thought Hansberry's work so important that he offered to underwrite the publication of his major work, The Rise and Decline of the Ethiopian Empire. It is also significant then, I'm trying to bring it back to Cornell's Africana, that Hansberry taught John Henry Clark, who helped conceptualize and structure Africana studies at Cornell. According to Turner, I was chatting with Turner yesterday, he said Hansberry would offer courses in New York City at what is now the New School for Social Research, to where people like John Henry Clark would go and take those courses. So Cornell then, that same Africana model that Clark in turn would provide the conceptual framework for, would be one which began then with the logic of an Africana studies, as I am indicating from Hansberry's guidance and through John Henry Clark. So while Cornell lays claim to being the first Africana studies department, this is a framework inherited from Hansberry. Although Hansberry's courses were popular with students, two distinguished faculty members at Howard accused him of teaching subject matter without adequate research to support it. With the program and his job on the line, he successfully defended himself before the Board of Trustees. One other interesting bit of information for me, though, I wanted to get to something else, but I'll come back. One other interesting bit of information for me, having worked on Claudia Jones for my book entitled Death of Karl Marx, I started wondering if Hansberry could have been related to the famous Lorraine Hansberry, playwright and dear friend of Claudia Jones, and perhaps the only woman that Harold Cruse singled out for attack in his book. You know, the famous Harold Cruse attack on Afro-Caribbean intellectuals and black radicals and communists and so on. It turned out, yes, this was Lorraine Hansberry's uncle. So an amazing circle of black activists and radical intellectuals in that period. So talking about Africana studies or African studies at Howard University, from my experience then, has to begin with Hansberry, and as Onwuachi insisted, Howard then has an amazing legacy in this field which has to be affirmed. What is helpful about contemplating a figure like Claudia Jones beyond the recovery it demanded was rereading figures like Sinclair Drake within the context of what he defined as transnational black radicalism. For scholars like Sinclair Drake, the logic of being a committed black scholar would be probably, he said, the most important antidote to a certain kind of individualistic and opportunistic turn in Africana studies. And even for years the challenge about why one should be committed and to what one should be committed to was always raised from time to time. His identification, though, is clear that it should be a commitment to liberation activity. And significantly, the African Diaspora Studies approach is one which charted for him a political and research agenda which incorporated Black, British, Caribbean, African American, and African subjects and practice. My point, though, is that addressing content, as we had to do in the early incarnation of Africana studies, is not the primary issue here, but the actual practices of faculty and institutions. Nor do we have assured the institutional recognition of efficacy of these studies, not as a remedial, but as an important component of the knowledge produced by the institution itself for the global well-being and in addressing the human rights concerns that are very obvious. The approach that I have worked with is called Decolonizing the Academy. It's a book that was published from a conference we organized when I was at Florida, which served as title to a conference and the book published as a result. The knowledge building then and creation of an academic library to support the various teachings and research claims is perhaps the easiest. A very healthy body of scholarship, particularly if we work with work already produced by women and men from different locations, adds to the large library of Africana studies materials available today. The basic work, though, of Africana studies still needs to be addressed. Still be a winter in addressing the so-called performance gap between white students and black students indicated that following Carter G. Woodson's logic in the miseducation of the Negro, it would be, quote, the order of knowledge itself, unquote, that structures the consciousness that holds us together as members of the westernized middle classes. What do our systems of knowledge do? How are human orders reproduced? I'm teaching a freshman writing class this semester, and before that class, none of them had ever heard of Carter G. Woodson. The beneficiaries of our work then still must be the dispossessed, which includes African diaspora peoples whose families have been separated from the continent of Africa by forced and induced migrations of Indian Ocean, trans-Saharan, and transatlantic slavery, and who still suffer from subordination in a variety of international locations, often contained in urban nightmares, indigenous peoples still dispossessed, destroyed, displaced, incarcerated, still ignored. Needed is some structure to target reinvestments by those in our communities who have benefited by those same systems, even as the larger governmental structures continue to ignore poverty, unless it touches them directly, as happened in New York City with that hurricane that came ashore, Sandy, right? The unyielding struggles to get black athletes to contribute to black programs is well known, and I'm sure you followed the debate between Harry Belafonte and Jay-Z recently on similar topic. A systematic knowledge engagement process for the black middle class who have often moved away and often do not recognize or understand the underground realities is also necessary, but also for working class communities often bereft of the knowledge produced in the academy unless they are able to get there to the academy. For scholars, it has to be a constant process of continuing education in order to expand the contours of our knowledge bases. Besides the Caribbean, the growing information about African descendant movements in Latin America and the need to fully understand the African diaspora in Asia are other examples. So the reinvigorating of black left studies and their conjunction with black and radical feminist work is another area. And there's beginning to be an interesting new library of scholarship in this area, which I'm sure some of you are following. Recent book, 2009, Want to Start a Revolution, Radical Women in the Black Freedom Struggle, is a good example, for it argues that accounting for women in radical movements effects a complete reperiodization and enlarges the boundaries of radicalism and provides additional connecting links. Now, I often love when I'm doing this to show this image because it was the title. Notice my book is called Left of Karl Marx. I want you to sort of take this in for a minute. Right. So if you go to London Highgate Cemetery, this is where you will find the bust of Karl Marx. It's about at least 11 feet high, and every day there are flowers, often red roses and stuff at the base of the bust of Marx. The flat stone that you're seeing to the left is Claudia Jones, the woman I worked on, who is from Trinidad and who gave us that title, Left of Karl Marx. And I often had really interesting engagement from scholars who say, is she really buried left of Karl Marx? How did she get right left of Karl Marx? I think she is left of Karl Marx. As you stand facing the Marx bust, she is left of Karl Marx. I guess some of you may say she's on the right hand, I don't know. But she's left of Karl Marx as far as I'm concerned. But I love to show this image because it makes it graphically come alive that I wasn't sort of making this up. So there you go. And this is, the book was mentioned, Claudia Jones Beyond Containment. This is Claudia having a parallel march in Washington, in London, which paralleled the march in Washington for Martin Luther King as well. Okay. So, right. So when I entered African Studies at Howard in Washington, D.C., D.C. and Howard were all that I imagined they would be. It was the mid-'70s, and black youth were active. Social and political consciousness and organizing was still in vogue. And elegance totally presented to overflowing audiences at Howard to adoring young women who would have willingly been prone, but many of whom were beginning to question the political location of women in the context of Afrocentric men who were asserting African traditions such as polygamy to which all should acquiesce. So Walter, this really happened. Walter Rodney lectured and was challenged by campus activists and classmates on the finer point of Marxism, which they felt he was not addressing fully. But Rodney was always clear of the limitations of Marxism to describe all our realities or be the full explanation for all our politics. And I had an interesting quote from him earlier that I want to go back to. This is what he says. Black people are here in these institutions as part of the development of black struggle, but only as a concession designed to incorporate us within the structure. He uses the term guerrilla intellectual to come to grips with the initial imbalance of power in the context of academic learning. Besides the institution, he says, I'm thinking also of the books, the references, the theoretical assumptions, and the entire ideological underpinnings of what we have to learn in every single discipline. And this is in Walter Rodney Speaks, pages 112 to 113. So the definition of black consciousness has been used, and people, you know, one can enter this from a variety of angles. One can go all the way to Garvey, of course, and look at his whole Emancipate the Mind, you know, from mental slavery, which Bob Marley would popularize. But many people go to Biko in South Africa because he provides one of the definitions of black consciousness, in which he talks about being black is not a matter of pigmentation, but of political consciousness. It's a mental attitude. And one could go to Fanon, of course, to look at the way that Fanon talks about that fracturing of the self that occurred when he was confronted by racism, and then how he had to rebuild that self in opposition to that dominating whiteness that cracked that self that he thought was intact. So in a sense then, the short-lived post-blackness or post-racial discourses, and I say short-lived because I think the post-black, post-racial debate ended with the Trayvon Martin trial, that's all, began to be too celebratory as racial structures remained, and as the academy and from the academy to the governmental levels, and definitely on the street via policing of various sorts, right? So I see myself as deliberately a member of a long-standing radical intellectual tradition. Cedric Robinson talks about the resoluteness of the black radical tradition, which he says advances as each generation assembles the data for its experience to an ideology of liberation. And people would say this differently. I mean, Fanon talks about the fact of each generation having a mandate to declare itself and make itself be recognized in terms of what it contributes. So Howard then, in that same period in which black consciousness prevailed, was a place to me that incubated all of that, from the popular culture to the intellectual spaces, the intellectual and the political organizing that was carried out. On campus, it was not unusual to have concerts by Stevie Wonder and Earth, Wind and Fire. Counters and the Mystic Revelations of Rastafari would begin their presentation in Crampton. So this is Washington, the belly of the beast. To loud acclaim from the audience, Bob Marley presented to an overflowing crowd in the RFK Stadium and at Blues Alley in Georgetown, to an audience where the smell of ganja hovered over the hall and where people openly passed blunts around, and one only had to breathe to engage the moment. So So how did the Caribbean enter in this context? I lived on a short residential street behind Columbia Road, then a neighborhood with Latino culture on its edges. And beginning then was gentrification, but also beginning was sort of Latinization as well on both ends. Across from my friend Carolyn's apartment was a movie theater where we learned routinely that the Immigration and Naturalization Service would close the doors and only let out those with appropriate papers and arrest all others who remain inside. Of course, this was destined to run the theater out of business. And the last time I saw it, it housed some sort of bargain goods store. I just drove through Columbia Road to come here, and I see it totally diverse, ethnically diverse community. But back then, we routinely hosted parties, and I was always making a pot of rice and peas for these events. There was a Cuban restaurant in the Adams Morgan area, and a Latin American store that sold bacalao, art shops. And amazingly, back then, there was a Claudia Jones Left bookshop. Does anybody remember that? And I had no idea, of course, as a young Trinidadian, who Claudia Jones was at that time. Just think about that, right? So having shared the #1 graduating position in my undergraduate class with one other person and planning a diplomatic career after getting admitted to both Columbia University and American U, I decided on the latter to pursue a master's in international relations. I wanted to be in DC because most of my family were in Brooklyn, but American University's International Relations MA was then populated by mid-career diplomats who had already done a tour of diplomatic duty and were fluent in European languages and could speak directly about those experiences that we were reading about. I was an Afro-puffed young black girl who felt totally out of place, but I had friends over at Howard. I was the only black student in the unit, and nobody seemed to make any effort to ensure that I was comfortable. So I would attend events at Howard, and then I made a quick political decision instead to attend the more exciting Howard University's African Studies program. For the second semester, it was immediately fulfilling. I learned the fundamentals of African Studies methodologies for fieldwork and research from P. Chika Onwachi, as I indicated, the then head of Africana Studies. But then there was a clear sense of separation between an African Studies program and an African American Studies program upstairs on the 3rd floor then. One doing the United States, the other Africa. My work, interestingly, on the Caribbean brought them together, as I ended up having advisors from both units on my thesis committee. Stephen Henderson, author of Understanding the New Black Poetry, came to African Studies building, he said, for the first time for my MA defense. He admitted Leon Damas of Negritude fame, then an African Studies professor, was my primary advisor. On Howard University campus, I routinely saw people like Sterling Brown, Hakeem Adubuti, John O'Killens. Dorothy Porter ran the Moreland Spingham Research Library, and you can imagine for somebody doing a thesis, I could just walk down the hall, go to the library, come back. One of the things then that happened at a place like Howard was that one was exposed almost routinely to a panoply of black intellectual figures as teachers, lecturers, visitors, or otherwise members of the campus community, often without knowing their value outside of the international context until much later. All of those names identified are pretty well-known writers in the black U.S. canon, but one had exposure on a day-to-day basis to C.L.R. James with his tall, lean presence and Stetson hat and open trench coat as a normal feature of campus life. Then, young poet Ethelbert Miller worked upstairs in the African American Studies Library, in the same founder's library where I worked as a library assistant, and was fast becoming the mature poet that he is today. And I didn't know he was going to be here, but I hoped that he would be here to hear that line. And I believe I saw him every single day of the week. Caribbean male students hung out on the steps of founders between classes to talk and curse about politics and home and everything else. I sat in on C.L.R. James's Pan-Africanism course routinely on the invitation of a fellow student boyfriend, and there I saw Sylvia Winter for the first time when she visited campus, a sophisticated black woman scholar in her prime, speaking to James' class at his invitation. I learned later on that James had described her as an intellect surpassed by none in the Caribbean. Through her, I realized the possibility of being a Caribbean woman scholar. From Leon Damas, I heard stories of encounters with Langston Hughes and life in Paris. I remember seeing once what I thought was a white man who seemed overtly overly comfortable with the campus, and I asked the librarian, who was that man who was so often warmly greeted on campus, only to be told, why, that's Sterling Brown. My African American literature courses were taught by Arthur P. Davies, editor of Cavalcade, then the preeminent source of African American literature before the field became the staple that it is in the Academy. Arthur P. knew everything there was to know about every writer in the canon at the time and taught his course in a conversational tone, expressing direct and personal knowledge of all the writers and their works. One final point is the importance of Leon Damas, one of the founders of Negritude in Paris, who taught, as I indicated, in the African American Studies department. He often invited us to his home for dinner with his wife in a lovely apartment in Southwest DC, surrounded by all the memorabilia and photographs of him, one now seasoned books. I would also run into him in the corridors of the Library of Congress, and no doubt establish myself to him as a scholar by that very fact. When, at the end of my Howard degree, I received a Commonwealth scholarship to go to Nigeria to study African literature, I began to make my plans for travel at what would seem a time congested with travel arrangements. Damas, and this is really important to hear this story, Damas gave me a project about 2 weeks or so before it seems I was to leave for Africa. He wanted me to catalog for him all the MA theses and PhD dissertations that had been done in the African Studies program at Howard. I completed the project in between a great deal of anxiety over traveling and preparing. In those pre-computer days, I typed the list repeatedly and turned it into Damas. He in turn handed me a check for $500, way beyond what the work was worth, and no doubt because he wanted to give me something to help my journey, but did not want to simply hand it to me, and instead found a mutually beneficial project that I could easily do. I remain forever grateful for his generosity. Tears still mist my eyes when I recall that experience, because that would be the last time I would see him. When I returned to the U.S. after getting my PhD in Nigeria, but also pregnant with my first daughter, I learned that he was gravely ill, and that in that same week he had passed. He was so excited over my success, and I wanted to share my experiences with him, but I never saw him again. It was Damas who instilled in me that anyone doing Africa or Caribbean studies is incompletely informed unless he or she is knowledgeable about Brazil. So conclusion, portable identity. I once wrote a solicited essay for publication of the Modern Language Association, PMLA, about my theoretical excursions and my definition of migratory subjectivity, as I had just published Migrations of the Subject, Black Women Writing and Identity. And I indicated there that it came out of my experience of navigating a range of communities, and that my personal experience for me in scholarship is about taking individual experiences out of the statistics into real life. I am never more startled than when some casual experience that I relate about my mother and her experience of working in New York, and I have a picture of my mother when she was in New York, is identified as a statistical reality for those doing political economy or the sociology of migration, for example. I was talking once with a colleague with whom I have co-written a few essays on the subject, and who was beginning then work on Caribbean migration, about my mother's frequent journeys back home and back and forth, which bothered my brother quite a bit. She indicated then that Caribbean women who migrated to the United States in their 50s, which was my mother's experience, had been documented as, in fact, part of a pattern of activities. The research revealed that their generation never planned to settle in the United States permanently, but saw their presence as helping to advance another generation. That's me. While they worked and helped to maintain critical connections at home, church, community, and family relationships. The idea of one's personal experience, then, being part of history, is something that many fail to fully understand, and what I hope to leave with you today. I'm very conscious of the implications of my various identities, honed in the Caribbean and in the U.S. I've lived in Nigeria, in Brazil, London, upstate New York, which I call the Twilight Zone. That's where the title for my book comes, Escape Routes from Twilight Zone. Well, it's true. Rod Serling was born in Binghamton and set most of that in Binghamton, New York. So for me, that's a Twilight. You'll see when you read the book. I've returned to live and work in Trinidad as well as an adult. I've experienced the U.S. South, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, Miami, New York, Chicago, right across from Lake Michigan. In each of these locations, I have taken some aspects of my portable Caribbean identity with me, and that identity has consistently overlapped with my Black woman identity, my identity as a faculty member in major universities, my community experiences, my experiences as a mother, consumer, traveler, scholar, and so on. The sense of being in transit, then, consistently marks my experience. One of my childhood girlfriends told me recently that she felt the same even before leaving the Caribbean, and as a young woman would drive with a guy friend to the airport and watch people come and go, as it gave her a sense of the possibility of going somewhere beyond given expectations, accessing elsewhere. Clearly, then, the range of political positions, identitarian locations that one occupies is informed by a series of concrete experiences. The time and context of entry into the U.S. informs the way one navigates U.S. culture. These can allow not so much full absorption as an option, but preferably a range of mobilities in different communities. But it also presents a clear loss of possible commensurate status at home. Being in the United States then, during the Black Power period, meant that one had to have a credible position on issues of African American rights to full participation in the society they helped create. One could not, and I believe still cannot, just reap the benefits of the African American civil rights and Black Power struggles, but instead one has to actively participate in social transformation. But it does not mean obliteration of any other identities one would hold, for indeed this was a time in that period, of course, and I think also still, when a range of cultural forms were being steadily built into the U.S. African-American experience, particularly at the level of popular culture. So, at a lecture in Binghamton a number of years ago, Claiborne Carson, who was working on a book on Martin Luther King Jr. and was presenting a lecture, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., indicated that Malcolm X, unlike King, was never a member of the Black community. When pressed on this subject by a number of student questioners, his response was that Malcolm X never participated in the Black church, never joined the Black frats or any other identified Black community mainstays and markers. This was a shocking assertion to many who saw Malcolm X as one of the most clarifying representations of being African American in the United States. But Malcolm X also had Caribbean background in one line of his family and was formed in part through his father's activism and both parents' participation in the Garvey movement. Manning Marable touches on this and gives some detail. Jan Carews, who recently passed, has a book, Ghosts in the Blood, I think it's called, which really documents Malcolm talking about his mother's memory of a Caribbean experience in Grenada and actually identifying family. Okay, and perhaps this is what disqualified Malcolm in his eyes from membership in quote-unquote the Black community, unquote, as Carson defined it then. But this is precisely what makes Malcolm X, in my view, fully African-American as well. A narrow reading of Black identity reveals that there is still in some visions a stereotyped Black community and not a range of Black communities. For me, a monolithic Black community has tactical political agency for political gains, but it is comprised nonetheless of a series of overlapping, intersecting Black communities, which is not so much disintegration as Eugene Robinson calls it. What seems to be happening instead is the creation of a series of intersections. This integration seems to presuppose a certain unity without conflict. Instead, we know that these communities overlap, collide, confront, alter, and are altered by each other and a range of other ethnic communities. Far from being invisible, these then are active presences. A sense of a portable self, then, able to cross over and deal positively with a range of communities, for me, identifies the desirable subject position in contemporary times. So how do these come together? I want to offer in closing a brief narrative, which recalls both Stokely and Onwuachi in the same frame, the scholar, the activist. So Stokely, as you know, as I indicated earlier, and you saw the image, had been a student at Howard, from which location his activism and his forays into this deep South would begin. But this is how he describes for me what was another amazing conjunction around activism and scholarship. Stokely was trying to get out of the South after some high-level activism, and police everywhere were looking for him. The mission was to leave Nashville without being arrested, So I'll pick up the story from Stokely here as relayed in his autobiography, Ready for Revolution. This is the story he tells. Someone else suggested they try one of her professors, an African. The same brother grumbled, that old African, what are you going to do? I'll call him, I said. All the professor said was, let me give this some thought. Call me back in an hour. When I did, he said, so where do you want to go, my brother? I said, Atlanta. Done, he said. You got it. Don't call me where you are. Have someone bring me the address. I will come get you. Next morning, the professor sounded buoyant. Quote, all set, my brother? You have a reservation. I'll be there in half an hour. I got the impression the brother was enjoying himself immensely. Hey, I'm not sure you can come where I am, I said. Why? Race, you'll stand out. He laughed, but that's precisely the point. I want to stand out. Don't worry, you'll see. But truthfully, I was beginning to wonder if this African was not some kind of flake. The bell rings. I open the door. There stands a beaming African born on the continent in full traditional dress, with a gleeful twinkle in his eye, wearing a wide smile and carrying a small suitcase. He was enjoying himself. The brother had a brisk manner. You're a little tall for these robes, but no problem. You have a reservation in my name, so you'll be traveling as Chike Onwachi of Nigeria. You are my elder brother, and you don't speak much English. I'll escort you in speaking loudly in Igbo. All you have to do is nod and mumble. Okay, leave the talking to me. He reaches into the suitcase and produces robes and a red hat. Put these on. He does some white powder on my temples and eyebrows. Look at yourself, he laughs. You look just like an old easy. Now you'll walk into the airport leaning heavily on this stick. I'll take your other arm. So that's what we did. Walk through with Brother Chike, keeping a running conversation with himself in Igbo. A lot of cops are in the airport and not many young black men. I saw cops nudge each other and grin as the two old Africans in their bright robes chattering in their strange language. Page 555, Ready for the Revolution. All I will say finally then is that it was an honor to have been taught in an African Studies program that was begun by Leo Hansberry and in my time was run by someone who not only understood but practiced African diaspora politics and activism, and that in many ways this is one of the iconic stories that brings to life for me the conjunction between Black consciousness, Howard University, and African Studies. I thank you so much.
Our celebration of our 60th anniversary. That reflection in Howard's history was really rich and quite meaningful, especially, I'm sure, for us in the department, for me, especially the young folk in the department. I wanted to thank everybody for coming, and there's certain groups on campus that I particularly want to thank for their support, their continued support for our events for the 60th anniversary. And I'll start, of course, with the College of Arts and Sciences, Dean Badagation and his team. I see Dean Jarman here. I don't know if Dean Badagation made it, but thank you very much. Also support from the graduate school. I saw Dr. Harris here before. Appreciate all of that support. Dr. Carl, I think, was here before, and the Department of Afro-American Studies, the University Library System, certainly Dr. Howard Dodson, provided support and funding for the reception that we're going to have immediately after this. Dr. James Davis in the Department of World Languages and Cultures. Dr. Edna Medford in the Department of History. Dr. Bichetta Merritt in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film. The Ralph Bunche Center. I don't know if Dr. Scott is here, but also has been the venue for a number of our events, and so we thank him for his continued support. We also have a number of graduate student volunteers who have worked really tirelessly on putting together all of these campaigns and especially organizing our alumni for these celebrations. Piwo Nyamdu, Lindo Nyamdu, Anya Basin, Shannon Warren, Nagla Mahmood, Bathsheba, Bryant, and Wheeler Winstead in particular deserve recognition and our great, great thanks. And of course, none of this is possible without our administrative assistant, Ms. Spratt, who's wonderful at helping us organize all of these things. And then a final thanks to Vortex Audiovisual, Mr. Clarence Smith, for helping us get everything organized and set up correctly. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you again, Dr. Davies. And there is a reception. I think the food and everything is in the back. Oh, okay. I was smelling something over there.
Everything that can be. Okay, just a minute.
A starting execution. But I was going to say,
Students wanted to ask questions of her.
What's that?
The students wanted to ask questions of her that would permit Black consciousness in unknown.
Dr. Johnson to make sure that there was questions and answers. I'm sure Carole would have also.
She said she wondered why.
Yeah. Well, our mistake. Yeah.
There's one thing that.
Oh no. Oh, where are you going? Is that how you leave us? It must be for a woman, eh?
The other one who came to
she got the flyer. It's not out yet. Oh, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. No, I'll get the 2 tickets for you. No problem.
Tomorrow we are only there for half day.
Yeah.
We are only here for half day.
No, I'm going to call Abdul Rashid right now. I called him earlier, but he wasn't in his office.
So you should have it today.
Right, yeah.
I don't know about it, and you know this whole thing with Marx. I saw, we had this little house in Montreal. It was where Malcolm X's father used to come and visit.
Oh, really?
Yes, where they used to have the little meeting. You know, I mean, the whole thing is like I went to Ephesus and I didn't know that Turkey played such a role in the life of Christianity and of Christ. I went into the house of Mary, where she lived after they were running away from, after Christ died. Then the apostles went on the run. And she lived in the house upon the hill where they entered.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I went there.
Amazing.
Saw all of that.
Yeah. Oh, so good. We got these students here with Carol. Hey, kiddo. How you doing, bro?
Are you live videotape?
Huh? Yeah.
The lecture was great.
Got
Very
to
informative.
document
Very
it for history, right? Yeah.
Very important to our university.
Yeah, wonderful.
Just the student presence.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
You came back from others did not. But you made me good. It's totally come against Sean, what he's trying to do now. I am very grateful to you guys for what you have for me.